Imagine this. You've just baked a fresh loaf of bread and need a new pair of shoes. So you march over to your neighbor and say, "I'll trade you this bread for a pair of shoes." But your neighbor shrugs and says, "I don't need bread. I want apples." So now you're off hunting for an apple farmer to trade bread for apples just so you can return and finally get those shoes. Sounds exhausting, right? Well, here's the kicker. This scenario never happened. That barter system story you learned in school? It's a myth, a made-up tale to explain how money came into existence. People didn't wander around swapping chickens for chairs or goats for grain. The real story of how ancient trade and economies worked is much more fascinating and makes way more sense. Let's dig into the truth behind the myth and uncover what really happened in the ancient economies. It's not just interesting, it'll change how you think about money forever. The myth of the barter system starts with a single question: how did money come to be? Economists, particularly those from the 18th and 19th centuries, needed a neat little story to explain the origins of currency. Enter the barter system, a supposedly simple natural progression where people exchanged goods directly before someone had the bright idea of inventing money. This idea seemed logical, straightforward, and easy to teach, perfect for foundational economics classes and simplistic textbooks. Classical economists like Adam Smith popularized this narrative in his seminal work, The Wealth of Nations. He imagined an idyllic pre-money world where early humans, out of necessity, would trade goats for grain, chickens for shoes, or pottery for fish. According to Smith, barter was clunky and inefficient, which eventually gave rise to money as a universal medium of exchange. Here's the catch. There's no historical or anthropological evidence to support this. In reality, no ancient society operated primarily on a barter system. Anthropologists have scoured records and examined the practices of various indigenous communities, tribal groups, and ancient civilizations, and the evidence paints a completely different picture. Direct one-to-one exchanges of goods, where someone swaps an item immediately for something of equal value, were rare and mostly occurred between strangers or in cases of emergency. Even then, these exchanges were far from the dominant mode of trade. Imagine living in a barter-based society. You're a baker with extra loaves of bread, and you need a new pair of shoes. But what if the cobbler doesn't want bread? What if he's craving honey instead? Suddenly, you're stuck in an exhausting scavenger hunt to find someone willing to trade honey for bread, which you'll then exchange for shoes. The whole system collapses under the weight of its inefficiency. Economists call this the double coincidence of wants problem, and it's one of the major flaws in the barter myth. For barter to work, both parties must have exactly what the other wants at the same time and agree on its value. This isn't just inconvenient, it's implausible on any large scale. To truly understand the origins of money and trade, we need to shift our focus from the imagined barter system to what ancient societies actually practiced: credit and debt. In his thought-provoking book, Debt the First 5,000 Years, David Graeber challenges the simplistic barter narrative and argues that early economies were built on intricate systems of trust and social relationships. These societies didn't rely on an immediate exchange of goods, but instead operated on a more flexible system where obligations and promises took center stage. Imagine living in a small, tight-knit community. Everyone knows each other, what they do, what they produce, and what they need. There's no need to carry around physical currency or engage in direct trade because everyone trusts that things will balance out over time. Here's how these systems operated. If you gave your neighbor a bag of grain, they didn't need to pay you back immediately. They owed you a favor which could be repaid later, maybe with livestock, a day of labor, or something else of value. These informal debts weren't strictly tracked on paper, but were often remembered by the community. Everyone was accountable because your reputation mattered. If you didn't fulfill your obligations, you risked social alienation, which was often worse than financial debt. Debt wasn't viewed as inherently bad or shameful. It was simply a part of life. In fact, being indebted to someone often strengthened bonds between individuals because it ensured ongoing interaction and mutual support. For instance, if a farmer lent grain to a neighbor during a poor harvest, it wasn't just a transaction. It was an act of goodwill that reinforced community ties. The neighbor would feel a sense of obligation to repay the favor, creating a cycle of trust and cooperation. Let's take a quick trip to the Trobriand Islands, where people engage in something called the Kula Ring. This is an elaborate system of gift-giving where necklaces are exchanged in one direction and armbands in the other. The items don't have inherent value. They're symbols of social connection. Now, if you walked into this society with a chicken and demanded an armband in return, they'd look at you like you were crazy. Why? Because their economy wasn't transactional. It was relational. The idea of bartering goods outright doesn't align with how most pre-modern societies actually worked. So if barter didn't lead to money, what did? The answer is both fascinating and a little bureaucratic: temples and taxes. In ancient Mesopotamia, temples acted as central hubs of economic activity. These temples issued receipts for goods deposited there, essentially an early form of currency. Later, governments took this idea and ran with it, introducing coins as a way to standardize taxes and military payments. Here's a fun tidbit. Some of the earliest coins were made by the Lydians in what's now Turkey. These coins weren't just currency. They were propaganda stamped with symbols of the state to remind everyone who was in charge. Let's talk about debt because it's central to this whole story. In Graeber's Debt, he argues that the concept of debt is as old as human society, but ancient debt wasn't always the villain it's made out to be today. In many ancient societies, debt was manageable because it operated within a system of mutual trust. However, as societies grew more complex, debt began to spiral out of control. Take the case of ancient Rome. Debt was a major factor in social unrest. Wealthy elites lent money to the poor, and when the poor couldn't pay, they were often enslaved. This pattern repeated itself throughout history, and it's a stark reminder that financial systems are never neutral. They reflect the power dynamics of the society they exist in. If barter is a myth, why does it still pop up in? The barter story is an easy-to-understand narrative for teaching foundational economic concepts. Imagine trying to explain the complex web of trust-based credit systems or the nuanced origins of money to a classroom of beginners. It's far easier to say, first people traded goats for grain, and then money was invented to simplify things. The barter myth owes much of its staying power to Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. Smith used the barter story as a hypothetical scenario to illustrate the inefficiency of direct exchange. While he didn't claim it was historical fact, later economists treated it as such, embedding it into the canon of economic thought. Smith's influence on modern economics is so profound that even his conjectures are often taught as gospel. By repeating the barter myth, textbooks continue to echo his ideas, perpetuating a story that simplifies the origins of trade and money. Also, textbooks are notoriously slow to change. Once an idea becomes part of the educational curriculum, it tends to stick around, even if it's debunked. The barter story has been a cornerstone of economics education for so long that revising it would require rewriting not just textbooks, but also the way introductory economics is taught worldwide. Understanding the myth of barter isn't just an academic exercise. It has real-world implications. When we question the stories we've been told about money and economics, we open the door to reimagining how our financial systems could work. For example, what if we designed economies around relationships and trust rather than pure transactions? Could we rethink debt as a tool for mutual aid rather than exploitation?